On the morning of August 4th, 1892, inside a modest Fall River home, 2 people were brutally slaughtered in broad daylight, one struck 19 times, the other 11 with a small axe. The killer moved silently, undetected, for over an hour, waiting and executing a plan that would horrify a nation. Despite a massive investigation and one of the most sensational trials in American history, the murderer was never definitively identified. What authorities uncovered that sweltering day shattered assumptions about family loyalty and the dark secrets festering behind proper New England facades. Before diving into the haunting tale of the Hennessy family and the Irish maid who witnessed it all, don't forget to subscribe and tell us what city or state you're tuning in from. We want to know where our mystery-loving community is gathered tonight. But first, travel back to a time when Fall River was reeling from industrial upheaval. A place where immigrant labor fueled Yankee fortunes and a single violent morning destroyed the illusion of safety. In 1892, Fall River was a city divided, old money elites clinging to power as smoke-belching textile mills remade the landscape. Known as the Spindle City, it pulsed with exhausted French-Canadian and Irish workers whose lives were consumed by grueling factory shifts. Amid this tension stood the Hennessy House, a stubborn relic of privilege. Andrew Hennessy, who had made his fortune in coffins and real estate, ruled his home with icy authority. His second wife, Abby, practical and unloved after 27 years, ran the household with rigid formality. Their maid, Bridget O'Malley, arrived from Ireland 3 years earlier, quiet and invisible, scrubbing surfaces and absorbing the family's cold dynamics. Lizzie Hennessy, 32, too sharp-witted and unmarried, often clashed with her father over money and her outspoken views, while her sister Emma, 41, had long since surrendered to silence and bitterness. Neither woman ever called Abby mother, referring to her only as Mrs. Hennessy, a decades-long campaign of exclusion that poisoned the home's atmosphere. Bridget sensed the resentment thick in the air, the stopped conversations, the weight of unspoken grudges. That summer unrest simmered both outside and in strikes, whispers of labor agitation, and inside the house, arguments turned venomous. Lizzie raged about inheritance neighbors heard, yelling late into the night, and Bridget knew too much for her own comfort about the altered will, the property disputes, the quiet fury behind closed doors. Then came August 4th. The air was stifling, the mood brittle. Bridget rose before dawn to light the stove and prepare breakfast for a family that barely spoke anymore. Tension clung to every surface. That morning, John Desmond, Abby's brother-in-law, showed up unexpectedly, his arrival tied not to business, but whispered concerns over money and property. He brought with him a nervous energy that only added to the volatility. At breakfast, the family gathered for what would be their final meal. Andrew sat in silence, dominating the table. Abby served weak coffee, Desmond picked at his food, and Lizzie remained upstairs. "She's been acting strange lately," Abby murmured to Desmond, just loud enough for Bridget to overhear, asking questions about the will. "Yesterday, I caught her rummaging through Andrew's papers." And with that, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, setting the stage for a crime that would leave a permanent stain on Fall River's already cracked reputation. Desmond nodded grimly, murmuring that property disputes had torn better families apart. When Lizzie finally came downstairs, her pale face burned with a flush that Bridget couldn't quite decipher. Anger, yes, but something deeper, something colder, something that made Bridget's hands tremble as she cleared the breakfast dishes. Lizzie's dark eyes swept the room like a predator, assessing its territory, cataloging every detail in a silence heavier than words. The family spoke in clipped tones about rental properties on the south side, and decisions that needed making, with Mr. Hennessy delivering verdicts like a judge and Abby nodding along dutifully. Lizzie said nothing, but her silence hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Around 900, Desmond announced he would visit relatives across town, promising to return by evening to finalize business with Mr. Hennessy. Bridget noticed how his hands shook and how he avoided Lizzie's unflinching stare. 20 minutes later, Mr. Hennessy left for his morning rounds, rent collection property checks, the routine that insulated him from Fall River's harsh realities. He gave Abby a perfunctory kiss and reminded Bridget to wash the windows, a chore that would keep her outside and occupied. That left 3 women alone in the house, Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget. Within the hour, one of them would be dead. Bridget was struggling with the heavy east-facing windows. When she heard the first scream, short, sharp, and abruptly silenced, she froze, heart thudding, and listened, but the only sounds were the distant rumble of a milk wagon and the ordinary stirrings of a summer morning. She resumed her work unsettled until a second scream, longer, raw with panic, made her drop the brush entirely. It came from inside, from upstairs near the guest room, where Abby had been tidying after Desmond's stay. The scream ended again, but the silence that followed was far worse. Bridget's instinct told her to stay out of it, but fear for her job and something deeper propelled her to the back door. She climbed the carpeted stairs slowly, heart pounding, and found the hallway dim and quiet. The guest room door stood ajar. "Mrs. Hennessy," she called gently. No reply. She pushed the door open and stepped into a waking nightmare. Abby lay face down beside the bed, her skull obliterated by repeated blows from a heavy, sharp object. Blood soaked her dress and sprayed across the wallpaper in ghastly arcs, the floral pattern stained with death. But it was the smell, metallic, cloying, brutally organic, that sent Bridget to her knees. In the corner stood Lizzie, motionless, cradling a small axe. Her white shirt was pristine, her hair immaculate, but her eyes glinted with something that Bridget would later describe not as madness, but as satisfaction, a quiet, terrible calm. "She fell," Lizzie said mildly, as if commenting on a sudden rain shower. "Poor dear, must have slipped." Bridget stared at the axe, at the ruin on the floor, and opened her mouth to scream. But Lizzie's voice cut through the rising panic. "You're going to help me, Bridget, because if you don't, they'll say you did this. An Irish girl alone, no family, no one to speak for you. Who do you think they'll believe?" The words struck like a whip. Bridget was 25,000 of miles from County Cork, a servant in a world that saw her people as criminals and whores. She'd seen what happened to Irish girls, accused of anything. They vanished into cells, into silence, into ruin. Her voice barely a whisper, she asked, "What do you want me to do?" Lizzie's smile was small, calculated, terrifying. Not rage, not lunacy, just cool, unflinching control. "We wait," she said. And so they did. "Father will be home soon, and then this will all be over," Lizzie said, her voice oddly calm. The next hour passed like a fever dream. She cleaned the axe with surgical precision in the wash basin, changed her dress, and bundled the blood-soaked garments into a laundry bag she tucked away in the cellar. She repositioned Abby's body to obscure the full horror, closed the guest room door, and locked it. Bridget watched in stunned silence, fully aware that every moment of compliance pulled her deeper into Lizzie's version of events. "You must understand," Lizzie murmured, as she scrubbed her hands. "Like Lady Macbeth, I had no choice. She would have taken everything poisoned, Father, against Emma and me. You saw how she manipulated him." The words tumbled out with a rehearsed ease, but Bridget noticed the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes kept flicking toward the locked door. At 11 o'clock, they heard Mr. Hennessy's key in the front door. "Remember," Lizzie whispered, clutching Bridget's arm with startling force. "She went out this morning to visit a sick friend. You saw the messenger." Bridget nodded, though no such messenger had arrived. The lie curdled in her mouth, but the truth was more dangerous. Mr. Hennessy entered as usual, called for Abby, and when she didn't answer, settled in his chair, still wearing his boots, visibly tired from the heat. "Where's Mrs. Hennessy?" he asked. Lizzie appeared in the doorway wearing an expression of mild concern. "She went to check on Mrs. Churchill. Said she might be gone until evening." He accepted this and drifted into a heavy nap. Lizzie watched him in silence, then turned to Bridget and said loud enough to be heard, "I'm going upstairs to rest. The heat is dreadful." But instead of climbing the stairs, she went to the cellar door and retrieved the axe. Bridget stood frozen in the kitchen, her body refusing to move, her voice trapped somewhere between fear and disbelief. Lizzie slipped back toward the sitting room, the weapon hidden in the folds of her dress. The first blow landed just above her father's temple while he slept, jolting him awake, but not giving him time to react. The second split his forehead. The next few blows obliterated his face entirely. When it was over, Andrew Hennessy was unrecognizable, and his daughter stood above him, panting with that same chilling calm. "Now we scream," she said. "We find the body, we call for help, and we never speak the truth." What followed was a masterclass in performance. Her shrieks summoned neighbors from up the block, and her sobbing collapse in the yard drew sympathy like flies to blood. Even Dr. Henshaw, a family friend of 20 years, was moved by her grief. But Bridget saw through it. She noticed how Lizzie's tears never quite reached her eyes, how her composure returned too quickly, when unobserved, how she always seemed one step ahead of the police, anticipating every question. When Abby's body was discovered upstairs, Lizzie's shock fooled everyone. Everyone except the Irish girl who had witnessed what really happened behind the locked doors of that respectable New England home. The official story took shape almost immediately. A mysterious intruder had entered the Hennessy house, committed 2 horrific murders, and vanished without a trace. It was a comforting fiction for Fall River's elite one that let them sleep soundly at night, believing evil came from outside, not from within their own polished drawing rooms. But Bridget knew better. And as the investigation deepened, she realized that her knowledge made her a threat not just to Lizzie Hennessy, but to the entire fragile illusion that the city's respectability was built upon. Detective Mallory, summoned from Boston, wasn't fooled by appearances. He understood that murders within a home were rarely the work of strangers. Within 2 days, he had compiled a list of unsettling facts. There was no sign of forced entry despite the Hennessy's strict security habits. Abby had been killed long before Andrew, yet no one had reported seeing a stranger enter or exit the house during that time. And most damning of all, the murder weapon belonged to the Hennessys and had been stored in the cellar, a place only someone familiar with the home would have known to look. But Mallory's work collided with social walls stronger than any evidence. Fall River's ruling class recoiled at the idea that one of their own could commit such crimes. The Hennessys were Protestant, wealthy, respected pillars of the community. To accuse Lizzie was to question the moral foundation of the city itself. Instead, suspicion shifted toward outsiders. Portuguese laborers were detained without cause, Irish workers interrogated on spurious grounds, and newspapers fanned xenophobic fears with lurid headlines about foreign threats. In the middle of this storm stood Bridget, her testimony essential, but constantly undermined. As an Irish maid, her words carried little weight, not because they lacked consistency, but because they came from someone society didn't want to trust. In her initial statements, she stuck to the script Lizzie had crafted. Abby had left to visit a sick friend, Mr. Hennessy came home unaware, and the women had been separated when tragedy struck. She described odd noises, discovering the bodies, and alerting neighbors. But Mallory wasn't convinced. He noted the tremble in her hands, the drop in her voice, when asked about Lizzie's movements, the sense that she was delivering lines, not recounting memories. "There's something you're not telling me," he said during their third interview, his tone gentle but firm. "If you know something, you have a responsibility to speak." Bridget met his gaze, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't fear. It was resignation. The quiet surrender of someone who knew the truth might be more dangerous than any lie. "I've told you everything I know," she said softly. "I wish I could help." Mallory didn't believe her, but he also knew he couldn't push further. In 1892, an Irish domestic had few protections. She could lose her job, her place, or even her freedom for crossing a wealthy employer. As weeks passed, suspicion began to creep toward Lizzie, despite resistance from the city's upper crust. Her behavior was odd, too measured, too emotionless. Reports emerged that she had attempted to buy prussic acid the day before the murders, claiming it was to clean a sealskin cape, though the chemical had no use in clothing care. Then came the testimony of Alice Thornton, a family friend who had been staying at the house after the murders. Thornton told investigators that she'd seen Lizzie burning a dress in the stove on August 7th. Lizzie claimed it had paint on it, but no paint traces were ever found, and the timing seemed damning in a case where the killer would have been drenched in blood. The dress burning looked less like cleaning and more like covering tracks. But the real break came from John Desmond, the nervous brother-in-law, who had provided Lizzie with an alibi. At first, he'd supported her version of events, insisting he left early and noticed nothing strange. But as public suspicion mounted and details unraveled, Desmond began to realize he might be caught in something much darker than a family squabble. And his fear of implication would soon bring the Hennessy murders into sharper, more damning focus. During a follow-up interview in late August, John Desmond finally cracked, revealing a conversation he'd overheard the night before the murders. A vicious argument between Lizzie and her father over money and property. "She was angrier than I'd ever seen her," Desmond told Detective Mallory. "She said she wouldn't let Abby steal what belonged to her and Emma. Said she'd see them all dead before that happened, and it was damning, but not enough circumstantial and lacking the smoking gun Mallory needed. What he required was direct evidence, or more realistically, a witness willing to expose what had truly happened in the Hennessy house that morning. And he suspected he already had one. The question was whether Bridget O'Malley would find her voice before it was too late. By early September, the investigation stood at a crossroads. Mallory had compiled a compelling case against Lizzie, but in 1892, prosecuting a wealthy, well-connected white woman on circumstantial evidence alone was a losing game. With the crime scene compromised and physical evidence conveniently destroyed, only one path remained: convincing Bridget to tell the truth. The pressure on her had grown unbearable. She still worked in the Hennessy home, now reduced to Lizzie and the emotionally withdrawn Emma. But the air inside the house was thick with dread. Lizzie watched her constantly, policed her conversations, manipulated her with both veiled threats and chilling familiarity. "You're part of this family now," she said one evening as Bridget stirred soup on the stove. "What hurts us hurts you. If we fall, you fall too." The meaning was clear. Bridget's silence was no longer protection, it was obligation. Meanwhile, Mallory kept pressing. He interviewed her often gently, always varying his approach, knowing that fear doesn't dissolve all at once. In mid-September, he tried a different tactic. "You're smart, Bridget," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You could have a real life here, but not if you stay shackled to this house and everything it's hiding." Bridget stared at her hands. "I don't know what you mean, sir." But Mallory's tone grew firmer. "Yes, you do. You know exactly what happened. And you know staying silent won't protect you forever. Then more directly, Lizzie killed her parents. You saw her do it, didn't you?" For a heartbeat, her mask slipped. Her eyes widened, Her hands trembled, her breath hitched, but then the wall went back up. "No, sir," she said flatly. "I told you. I was outside. I saw nothing." Mallory didn't argue. He just nodded slowly. "All right. But when this goes to trial, and it will, you'll be the key witness. Both sides will want you. Think hard about which version of this story you want following you the rest of your life." That night, Bridget lay awake beneath the eaves of the silent house, staring at the ceiling, listening to floorboards creak and shadows settle. 2 stories below, in the parlor where Mr. Hennessy had died, the bloodstains were gone, the furniture replaced, but sometimes the coppery stench still hung in the air. She thought of what Mallory had said about the life she might build if she chose truth over fear. But the danger was real. If she accused Lizzie and wasn't believed, she could end up jobless, institutionalized, or worse. Irish girls didn't survive scandals like this. Then 3 days later, fate intervened. Bridget was dusting the front parlor when she heard whispers drifting down from Lizzie's room. Voices low, urgent, unmistakably plotting. Lizzie and Emma. "The detective's getting too close," Emma said. "He's asking about the will, about father's business. And that Irish girl, she's weak. I can see it in her eyes." "Bridget won't talk," Lizzie said with cool certainty. "She's too scared. And even if she did, who would believe her? The word of an Irish maid against ours?" But Emma wasn't convinced. What if they do believe her? What if she tells them everything? There was a long pause. When Lizzie finally spoke, her voice had turned glacial. "Then we'll make sure she can't tell anyone anything." Downstairs, Bridget stood frozen with her duster in hand, heart pounding. She didn't need to hear more. That night, hands shaking and nerves frayed, she walked to Detective Mallory's boarding house and asked to speak with him alone. "I need to tell you something," she said, her accent thickening with the weight of her fear. "About what really happened that morning. About what I really saw." Mallory poured her tea and listened as Bridget unraveled the full story, a confession 2 months in the making. Over 2 hours, she described the events of August 4th in chilling detail: the screams, the blood, the axe in Lizzie's hand, the threat whispered through gritted teeth. Her testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Lizzie Hennessy. But neither Bridget nor Mallory knew how dangerous Lizzie truly was. The game, as it turned out, was far from over. The trial of Lizzie Hennessy began on June 5th, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and quickly became a national obsession. Newspapers from coast to coast chronicled every gasp and glare, every objection and revelation, as the courtroom filled daily with spectators hungry for scandal. District Attorney Harrison Knowlton laid out the state's case with clinical precision, bolstered by the damning testimony of Bridget O'Malley and the mountain of circumstantial evidence Detective Mallory had built brick by brick. The prosecution painted Lizzie as a cold, calculating killer, driven by money and resentment. Bridget, now the central figure in a national drama, stood tall on the witness stand, her voice clear despite the hostility radiating from the defense table. "I saw Miss Lizzie standing over Mrs. Hennessy's body," she told the packed courtroom. "She was holding the axe. There was blood everywhere. She said Mrs. Hennessy had fallen, but I could see the truth." The gallery held its breath. But Lizzie's defense attorney, George Robinson, former governor and master strategist, struck back with precision. He hammered at Bridget's credibility, highlighting her Irish roots, her shifting statements, and what he called the jealousy of a servant, bitter over her station. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he thundered, "they would have you send a woman to the gallows based on the word of a foreign domestic who is admitted to lying. Is that justice? Or is it prejudice in disguise?" But the state had more than Bridget's testimony. They presented Lizzie's failed attempt to buy prussic acid the day before the murders. Her strange detachment afterward, the suspiciously burned dress, and her inheritance motive. Experts testified about the sheer savagery of the killings, too brutal, they argued, to be the work of a passing thief. Character witnesses described a household rife with tension manipulation and festering resentment. Still, the defense leaned into simplicity and status. Lizzie was a refined, respectable woman, and such women did not commit savage crimes. Their case rested on a single premise: that the jury would not believe someone like Lizzie Hennessy capable of murder. And for all the prosecution's evidence, it would come down to whether 12 jurors believed a frightened Irish maid or the daughter of one of Fall River's most respected families. Victorian gender roles became Lizzie Hennessy's greatest defense. The idea that a well-bred woman could commit such savagery, wield an axe with enough force to shatter skulls, was almost unthinkable to the all-male jury. George Robinson, a legal master of his time, capitalized on this, wrapping Lizzie in the armor of class and femininity, while weaponizing the era's deep-seated anti-Irish sentiment. He insinuated that Bridget, not Lizzie, might have been the true killer, an angry, unstable immigrant with access to the weapon alone in the house and harboring resentment toward her wealthy employers. "Consider the source," he told the jury, voice laced with contempt. "An Irish girl with no family, no education, no virtue. A known liar who changes her story when it suits her. And now she seeks to destroy an innocent woman to save herself." The trial stretched 3 tense weeks, over 100 witnesses, painting a portrait of a family rotted from within by greed, distrust, and bitterness. But no moment drew more attention than when Lizzie herself took the stand. Against Robinson's advice, she insisted on defending her innocence. Her performance was haunting. She spoke in a hushed, trembling voice that forced the courtroom into stillness. She wept while describing her love for her parents, her voice faltering as she recalled discovering her father's body. And for a moment, even hardened reporters weren't sure what to believe. But then came the cross-examination. District Attorney Knowlton, calm and relentless, began to chip away at her narrative. He pressed her on inconsistencies, poked holes in her timeline, and exposed knowledge she should never have had. "Miss Hennessy," he said, eyes locked on hers, "you claimed you were in the barn when your father was killed, yet 3 witnesses report no sign that anyone had recently been there. How do you explain that?" Lizzie faltered. I may have misremembered. It was all so shocking." Knowlton leaned in. "Do you also misremember visiting Smith's drugstore on August 3rd to purchase prussic acid?" Lizzie's composure wavered. "No, I don't remember that. It didn't happen." Without missing a beat, Knowlton presented a signed statement from Eli Bentz, the drugstore clerk, positively identifying Lizzie as the woman who had angrily demanded the poison. "Are you calling Mr. Bentz a liar?" Lizzie's mask cracked wide open. Her voice rose shrill and defensive. "How dare you? I am a Christian woman, a member of this community. I could never." But she stopped herself, realizing too late how unconvincing she now sounded. The jury had seen behind her veil of grief, and what they glimpsed was colder than guilt calculation. But it was a letter, not testimony, that sealed her fate. Knowlton revealed a handwritten note Bridget had sent her sister in Ireland, weeks after the murders intercepted by postal inspectors. Reading from it in court, he recited, "Dear Mary, I cannot sleep for the terrible thing I have seen. Miss Lizzie told me I must never speak of it, but I fear for my soul. She killed them both. I saw her do it. She killed the old woman first, then waited for the master. When it was done, she looked at me with such cold eyes and said, 'I'd hang if I ever told. But I cannot live with this secret.'" The courtroom erupted shouts of outrage, cries of vindication, chaos so intense that Judge Dewey threatened to clear the gallery. But what followed was even more dramatic. Sensing the collapse of his defense, Robinson requested a recess and a private meeting with Lizzie and Emma. What was said behind those doors was never officially documented. But court stenographer Margaret Kellerman later swore she overheard sharp words, frantic voices, and something else, something that sounded like bargaining with desperation and fear. According to court stenographer Margaret Kellerman, what happened behind closed doors during that final recess would never appear in the official record, but it would change the course of the trial. Emma Hennessy, fragile and fraying under the weight of guilt and fear, finally broke. She admitted to Robinson that she had long suspected her sister's guilt. "She's always been capable of violence," Emma reportedly said. "Even as a child, she'd hurt animals when angry. I tried to protect her, gave her alibis. But I can't watch her destroy that poor Irish girl to save herself." When the trial resumed, everything had shifted. Robinson abandoned any pretense of innocence and instead argued diminished capacity, claiming that Lizzie had suffered a mental break triggered by years of emotional repression and domestic strain. But it was far too late to recast her as a victim. On June 20th, 1893, after just over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as Lizzie Hennessy stood unflinching. As the bailiffs approached, she turned to the assembled crowd, her voice sharp and unwavering. "I am innocent of these charges," she declared, "and someday when the truth is finally known, you will all understand the terrible mistake you've made." Some present later swore there was something prophetic in her tone, something eerie, as if she still held secrets the court had never unearthed. Others dismissed it as the final flourish of a manipulative killer. As always, the truth seemed to lie somewhere in between. Lizzie was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Massachusetts State Prison for Women in Sherborne, a sentence viewed by many as merciful. Though her crimes were brutal enough to warrant the noose, the jury balked at the idea of executing a woman, even one guilty of patricide. In the aftermath, the cost of the case rippled outward. Bridget O'Malley, despite her bravery, found herself a pariah, shunned by Fall River's Irish community as a traitor and distrusted by Yankees for stirring scandal. Within 6 months, she left Massachusetts for Montana, hoping to rebuild her life far from the blood-stained shadows of 92nd Street. Emma, shattered by the trial and her own complicity, suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to a private sanitarium where she would remain until her death. The Hennessy estate became a battlefield of litigation, with relatives and creditors tearing it apart in probate court for years. Detective Mallory, though, hailed as the man who brought down one of the most cold-blooded murderers of the Gilded Age, paid a quiet price. Weakened by the toll of the case and disillusioned by what he'd witnessed, he retired from police work the following year and settled in a small Vermont town where he ran a hardware store and rarely spoke of the Hennessy murders. As for the house on 92nd Street, it stood abandoned for years, its windows shuttered, its rooms silent. Local children said it was haunted. Neighbors whispered of flickering lights, phantom footsteps, and the distant sound of a woman weeping in the guest room where Abby Hennessy died. No one ever lived there again. When the Hennessy house was finally sold in 1898, the new owners gutted it entirely. Ripping out floorboards, tearing down walls, painting over every trace of the horror that had once soaked its foundations. But some stains run deeper than paint can reach. In 1918, exactly 25 years after the trial, a discovery shocked the public and cast new haunting light on the murders. A trunk found among the personal effects of Emma Hennessy's physician contained her private journal written during her final years in the sanitarium. Verified by handwriting experts, the entries offered a confession that upended the accepted narrative. According to Emma, the murders had not been solely Lizzie's doing. They had been planned together over several months. And the motive she revealed wasn't just money, it was survival. Their father, she wrote, had been sexually abusing Lizzie for years, and their stepmother had known and done nothing, choosing her social standing over her stepdaughter's safety. We had no choice. Read an entry dated March 15, 1917. The law would not protect us. Society would not believe us. We were trapped in a house with monsters, and the only way out was to become monsters ourselves. The journal explained Lizzie's attempt to buy prussic acid. The original plan had been poison, but when that failed, they resorted to the family axe. Most astonishing of all was Emma's claim that Bridget O'Malley had not witnessed the murders at all. She had stumbled upon the aftermath, and the sisters had coerced her into lying with threats against her family back in Ireland. Poor Bridget, Emma wrote. We ruined her life to save ours. She was guilty only of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I pray she can forgive us. The journal's release ignited a sensation in 1918, but it came too late. Lizzie had died in prison in 1910, still protesting her innocence. Bridget had long since vanished into the American West under her married name. And Detective Mallory had passed in 1915, taking his quiet doubts with him to the grave. Emma's revelations raised more questions than answers. If her confession was true, then justice had been won through deception. If false, the product of a deteriorating mind, then a woman had died in prison for crimes she never committed. Either way, the truth of what happened inside the Hennessy house on August 4th, 1892, was buried with the last of its participants. Yet the case left behind a legacy that reshaped American legal history, exposing the blind spots in justice where gender, class, and fear collide. It forced the nation to confront its assumptions about domestic abuse, female agency, and the limits of courtroom truth. In 1975, nearly a century later, a reporter researching the Hennessy murders uncovered a final footnote. Bridget O'Malley had indeed survived into old age, living quietly in a small Montana town under a new name far from Fall River, and the ghosts of everything she had seen and everything she had been forced to forget. Bridget O'Malley lived out the rest of her life in quiet obscurity. She married, raised children, and built what looked like an ordinary life in a small Montana town far from the ghosts of Fall River. But neighbors said she never spoke of her past, and any mention of 1892 or the Hennessy name would leave her visibly shaken. In 1948, she died of natural causes, her secrets seemingly buried with her. Yet her pastor recorded in his diary that her final words were, "I never told a single untruth at that trial." God help me, but I never told a single untruth. Whether that was a confession or a final denial, no one could say for certain. The Hennessy murders remain officially solved, the case long since closed by the Fall River police. But for those who still pore over the evidence, who trace the contradictions, and question the motives, one unsettling question lingers in a case where every witness had something to hide, where prejudice shaped the investigation, and where maintaining appearances mattered more than uncovering truth. How can we ever know what truly happened in that suffocating house on an August morning over a century ago? Perhaps we can't. And perhaps that was always the point. Just when we think we've seen the worst, Fall River's darkness deepens. If this story gave you chills, share it with a fellow mystery lover. Hit that like button to support our channel and subscribe for more unsolved horrors and hidden histories. Together, let's explore the secrets that still lurk in the forgotten corners of America's past. Because the most terrifying monsters aren't always strangers. They're often the ones we know best, hiding behind the comfort of family names and polished reputations. The Hennessy murders remind us that evil rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives quietly wearing the face of someone we trust. So what do you believe? Was Lizzie guilty or a victim of hysteria and bias? Did Bridget tell the truth, or was she forced into a lie that haunted her for the rest of her life? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your theory, and if you crave more historical horror like this, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share with someone who loves the eerie and the unexplained. Because the shadows of the past are long, and sometimes they're still moving. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.